The Volunteers. Chapter 3. War declared. The Curie family moved yet again, this time to 7 Errington Road, Paddington. Albert was 24 and a sergeant in the Territorials, and about to be balloted for membership to the Kensington Battalion Masonic Lodge. It was November 1913, just 9 months before the war broke out. By the following January he passed to the degree of Fellow Craft in the Lodge, and was raised to Master Mason on the 4th of March 1914. Battle of the Frontiers. From the 27th of July 1914, Britain began to respond to the gathering crisis in Germany. 2 days later, all regular soldiers were recalled from leave, and by chance the Territorial force had just been assembling for summer camp, had entrained at Addison Road Station on the 2nd of August for Salisbury Plain. At 10 that night they received orders to report to their drill hall. Full marks must be given to their commander that they were able to mobilize quickly under their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel F.G. Lewis. The first days of August were the time of the Battle of the Frontiers, waged against the German army by the Belgians and the French. The losses were high, and as the Germans were also attacking Russia, they were occupied on 2 fronts. Battle of Mons, 23rd to 24th of August, 1914. On Tuesday, the 4th of August, Britain was at war with Germany. Embarkation started on the 9th of August of the British Expeditionary Force. The 1st, 13th County of London, Princess Louise Kensington Battalion, the County of London Regiment, was mobilised on the 4th of August 1914, part of the then 24th Brigade, 8th Division. 90,000 men descended upon Southampton and Portsmouth to board ships for Boulogne, Rouen, and Le Havre, under the command of Sir John French. Their destination was Marburg. The army was made up of 4 infantry and 1 cavalry division. A division at this time equalled about 18,000 men. This sum included support troops. 2 or more divisions made up a corps, and 2 or more corps made an army. The landings were completed by the middle of August, and almost immediately they had gone into the line alongside the French army, trying to stem the tide of the German advance. They at once started to occupy the line and get dug in. And 16 days later, after becoming used to the place, they were ordered to retire, so as not to be cut off, and this was done by the Commander-in-Chief, General Joffre. After the French army had been defeated at the Battle of Charleroi, this British army was the original Old Contemptibles, and considered Britain's finest troops, capable of rapid, accurate firing with their Lee-Enfield rifles, capable of 15 aimed shots a minute. Albert Curie was a champion shot who shot regularly for the regiment at Bisley. He was capable of double that figure. Battle of Chapelle, 23rd of August, 1914. On the 24th of August, 1914, the German First Army of General Alexander von Kluck arrived at Chapelle, a village on the edge of Mons. They were following the Chiffon plan to outflank the Allies, to cut them off from using the Channel ports. The BEF was made up of 4 regular army divisions, arranged as the 1st Corps under Douglas Haig and 2nd Corps under Horace Smith-Dorrien. 3 hours later, 8 German battalions advanced against 2 battalions of the 3rd Infantry Division. D and B companies of the 4th Middlesex Regiment were overwhelmed by the 31st, the 85th and the 86th German Fusilier regiments. These three comprised the German 18th Division, and they forced the British back towards Paris. By midday, the British began to withdraw. To assist them, they requested reinforcements from the 2nd Battalion, Royal Irish. The remainder of the German First Army had by this time arrived, and although the Germans advanced, they lost considerably more men. It was considered a great strategic withdrawal, saving the French line from total collapse. The 4th Royal Fusiliers defended the northern approaches to Mons, and the remainder of D and B companies of the 4th Middlesex retreated to St. Symphorium cemetery on the outskirts of Mons. By 2 o'clock, the British could see that they were unable to withstand the pressure. The French army was retreating south together with the Belgian army, the British and their flank exposed and in danger of being cut off, falling back to Ypres on the 27th of August. It was claimed the Angels of Mons had aided the British army, and this was the first major action of the British Expeditionary Force, the retreat from Belgium to the Marne. The BEF was then moved to Flanders to be in easy reach of their supply base at the Channel ports, arriving the 2nd week of October. Battle of the Marne. From the 5th to the 14th of September 1914. The fighting in Belgium and France was along traditional lines, which was of armies surging backwards and forwards, in what is known as engaging, if forward, and retiring movements. At the beginning of September, the Allied retreat slowed down as the Germans lost impetus, becoming further from their supply base. This resulted in the Battle of the Marne, which halted the German spearhead, lasting until the middle of the month. After the battle, it was decided to move the BEF north to Flanders, convenient to the Channel ports. Travelling by train, 2nd Corps reached Abbeville on the 8th of October, 2nd Corps a day later, and 1st Corps following on. On the 11th of October, 4th Corps found itself close to Bruges and Ghent. 3 days later, the last gap in the Allied line was secured. The BEF held the line from La Bassee to the river Neuve, the French holding the southern flank. The First Battle at Ypres, 15th of October to the 22nd of November 1914. Early on the 3rd of November, the Kensington Battalion marched behind their band to Watford and entrained for Southampton. Embarkation was completed by the afternoon of the 4th. The battalion sailed for Le Havre, which came in sight by midday. There they marched off to Rest Camp 1, and the next day, mounting railway trucks, they steamed off for St. Omer, grasping their long Lee-Enfield rifles, reaching their destination on the 6th, and a period of training followed at Blenc-de-Quay. The major battle that first year for the British was the First Battle of Ypres, fought on October the 19th, by the BEF under the command of Field Marshal Sir John French. That month the Allies had reached Nieuport on the North Sea coast. The Germans captured Antwerp and forced its defenders back, and the 8th Division had been redeployed north to join 2 divisions of reinforcements recently landed in Belgium. They advanced east from St. Omer, halting the German forces at the Passchendaele Ridge. The division was lined up from La Bassee to Messines, and there was very little activity that you could hear from the battle raging to the north. The French Army Command and General Foch believed a coordinated attack would result in the recapture of the industrial city of Lille, then Belgium finally capturing Brussels. The German General Falkenhayn had other opinions. He ordered the capture of Dunkirk, Calais and Boulogne. he struck the Belgian defences on the Ypres river. By far it was the worst battle fought. There was an almighty clash of troops, and only a few miles down the road, Ypres, there was constant hand-to-hand fighting as the battle swayed from one side to the other. The problem for the British was that the position was vulnerable to superior German artillery. The British made a stand which formed a salient around Ypres, the battle becoming the massacre of the innocents of Ypres, the innocents being 8 German units of young volunteers, many of them students. Battle of the Arne. Almost immediately there came the 4 days' Battle of the Arne. The method of waging war changed to one of stagnation as each side settled down and dug battle lines. Henceforth the artillery, its insatiable appetite for ammunition, and the strung barbed wire developed into the western front. The lines from Ypres to Nieuport was held by the Belgians. Bethune, Lens, Arras, Bapaume, Verdun, and Saint-Quentin were to become synonymous with a great deal of suffering and death. At the start of November 1914, the Kensingtons were attached to the 8th Division as part of the 25th Infantry Brigade. The brigade included the 2nd Lincolnshires, the 2nd Royal Berkshires, the 1st Royal Irish Rifles, and the 2nd Rifle Brigade. The 8th Division was allocated a 4-mile stretch along the La Bassee road, in front of the village of Leventy. This was referred to as the La Bassee front, and lay opposite Ypres Ridge, northeast of Bethune at Artois. Battle of Non-Bassum. The last major attack on the British lines occurred on the 11th of November. This battle became famous because it was made by the Prussian Guards, and they broke through the British lines. A counter-attack by the 1st Guards Division was forced to take shelter in the woods before driven out by counter-attack. The fighting secured the close bond between the British and the French armies. The two fought side by side all around Ypres, in a fashion not used in earlier battles. The more the Germans extended their lines, the more the Allied troops did too, as the front stretched northwards, up Bapaume, Arras and Bethune, toward Ypres. During the 14th of November, the Kensington marched to Esther. This small mill town on the banks of the Lys was to become very familiar to the battalion. The low-lying land around the river and bridge, the lined cobbled roads shaded by tall poplars on either side, echoed to the sound of marching feet. The 8th Division was part of General Sir Henry Rawlinson's 4th Corps. He inspected the Kensingtons that Sunday after the battalion had reorganized itself into a 4-company structure. He recognized the enormous efforts made and made reference to it. The 8th Division went into the line just south of the Belgian frontier called Armentières. By the end of November, the terrible battles died down. Both armies were spent forces, needing to reform and rearm. The salient came to be attached to the Belgian name of the town, the villages, the farms and features: Mousetrap Farm, Cheddar Villa, Polygon Wood, Sanctuary Wood, Hill 60, and many more. At Neuve, Chapelle, the 1st Battalion lost 160 men, even though they had broken the German lines. The losses at Ypres Ridge, the losses were even higher, reducing the battalion to by 30%. There were several awards granted, and the gallant action by Captain Kimber rated a DSO. Over to the northeast, a village on a ridge provided cover and observation posts for the German observers. There they could see all that was going on. For the next 4 years, this ridge was to become a raging sore. The landscape a pulverized mass of pocketed, marked soil, and this was called Passchendaele, The Battle of Arn ended on the 13th of November 1914, the last battle of the first year of war. Back in England, in early October, parts of the 8th Division were forming up at Hursley Park near Winchester. Amongst them were the 2nd Battalion Kensingtons. In the last days of December 1914, 22 territorial battalions marched to join that British force in France, and within 2 further months another 26 followed them. After the terrible casualties, the 1st London Division was split up to provide reinforcements for other divisions. And as a result of these battles, the loss of so many men, not just in the Kensingtons, but also in other parts of the division, the 1st London was split up to provide reinforcements and substitutions for those killed. By March 1915, it ceased to exist at all. Later that month, though, thankfully, it was reconstituted, the gaps being made good by men from the 2nd Battalion, and together they were numbered the 56th London Division. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle. The Kensington Battle, as attached to the 25th Brigade, 8th Division, as a regular division engaging in their first major action at Neuve Chapelle. And as with all newly formed groups, this battle was planned as a local offensive mission involving the 7th and the 18th Divisions. The Indian Corps, with the 4th Corps, being to the north. The goal was Ypres Ridge and the ground beyond. The Kensingtons were relieved on March the 1st, and for the first time the 4 companies were united in billets in Le Francaise Mill, occupying lines of communication, a term used to describe troops who assisted the forward battle lines with ammunition, the job of the ammunition column to keep the supply of shells going up to them from the dump in the rear. The reserves, the pioneer support communications, constructing support trenches, unloading railway carriages and making sure the rations got through, and a host of other tasks to relieve the forward troops. Most of this work was done at night with the battalion horse teams. The BEF had 60,000 horses to supply all arms. The battalion joined the now reformed 1st London Division, the 56th, in the 168th Brigade under the command of Brigadier General Granville George Loch. On February the 8th, 1916, Brigadier General Loch commanded the 168th Brigade until it was demobilized, mentioned in dispatches and awarded the DSO in 1918. The 1st Battalion, now reinforced, occupied the outskirts, outside the town walls of St. Omer, a small provincial town with cobbled roads and looking very French. The large camp had been erected adjacent to the main road, where wagons and gun limbers lined the walls. Bell tents accommodating 8 men with duckboard floors were lined up in the field opposite. The ground was much used, making the main paths muddy and bare of grass. Ditches circled the fields under thorn hedges. Of the remaining London Rifle regiments were 50 or so men of the 1st Division, the Kensingtons. Also using the facilities were men of the Rangers who were in the next field. The Kensingtons, together with the rest of the 25th Brigade, moved out and marched from L'Estrême on March the 9th, equipped to move to the front. A meal was prepared at Red Cross and water bottles filled, after which the battalion took up positions in the support trenches. At 7:30 on the 10th, the artillery bombardment began, preparing the advance half an hour later. The assault troops rose up, clambering over the trench sides and surged forward. Despite the casualties, the advance continued, with the supporting troops passing through, keeping up the momentum. The Kensingtons, meanwhile, a quarter of an hour later, moved forward from their support trench into the vacated breastworks to prepare for the follow-up, to attack the second objective. The 25th Brigade, not being so fortunate, they were on the left of the divisional front, supported by the 24th Brigade. They had moved off before the advancing troops had totally cleared the way, and although by 1 o'clock the objective had been reached, the Germans had recovered and beginning to strengthen their lines. And that night neither side was aware what the morning would bring. The next morning further attempts were made to drive the enemy out of the ruins of the village, but the Germans were well concealed and protected by the collapsed houses, making the village into a stronghold. The Germans began to put down an artillery bombardment, and the attacking Kensingtons were cut down. The battle for Neuve Chapelle collapsed, and what was gained was consolidated. By the 16th, the dead were still lying around, and special recovery troops had to be brought in to collect up the bodies. 5,000 were killed or wounded. The Kensingtons lost 6 officers and about 150 men. The thought that the war would be over by the previous Christmas was quickly forgotten, as all the troops started to settle down to make the best of it. The glorious weather was a thing of the past, as the rain started to fall. This turned the one-time hard ground into vast areas of mud. The men were up to their knees in freezing water, waiting for the next downpour. The Germans had opened and redirected the ditches so that the water flowed downhill towards the British trenches, which were soon filled up. The trenches stretched south from Armentières to Festubert. The countryside was flat, plain and drab, with the hillier parts of the Messines ridge and Ypres salient to the north. To the south ranged mounds of coal tippings around Luz and Lens to the south, and although there were indications of places where battles had been fought, the country had not been pulverized into a morass, to be seen a few months later. The Second Battle of Ypres, the 22nd of April, 1915. By spring 1915 the fighting became again in earnest. The First Army attacked at Neuve Chapelle, a small, rather insignificant village, scarcely more than a cluster of scruffy cottages and barns. 3 weeks later the Second Army, to the north, launched an attack on a huge artificial mound that had been built up over the years of soil dug whilst constructing the railway cuttings nearby. This great mound was the southern part of the Ypres salient and became known as Hill 60. The Battle of Ypres Wood and Festubert, 9th of May, 1915. In the second week in April, there began the Second Battle of Ypres. This time the Germans made use of poison gas. There developed behind the lines a heated quarrel over the shortage of ammunition. At the Battle of Ypres Wood, in the second week of May, there occurred a great calamity, for the army ran out of ammunition for the guns. On the 28th of May, the battalion went into divisional reserve. The billets at La Vantie were a welcome sight as the battalion marched up, occupying the trenches at Pitcatin in fine weather, which made a nice change. It was late spring, the ground was hard and dry, and the sun shone. The battalion was given the task of taking the crater made by the Royal Engineers under the German line. The battalion was taken out of the line to train for the event. The Kensingtons moved up to the start line on the evening of the 8th of June. and at 5:40 the next morning the mines were exploded, and C and D companies advanced. In spite of the heavy losses, they took over the crater. A and B companies followed along behind in support, and 2 hours after the start they had secured their third objectives, the crater and the trench leading back to the old front line. The line was extended to Le Langre farm. The supply of bombs had now been reduced. There was no sign of any backup troops coming along. The brigade sent up the London Scottish in support, and by the middle of the morning only 24 men were standing their ground. Only 1 officer and 2 bombers arrived. An hour later the Germans had got to within 10 yards and were beginning to bomb the crater, using the ammunition from a disabled machine gun. The position was now desperate. The machine gun ammunition was running out, and at 2:45 General Pinney passed word to retire back to the farm. By that time no man's land was swept by German fire. The casualties piled up and were used to crawl round and to conceal them from the Germans, and once the farm was reached the German gunners had ranged onto it, and the survivors had to retreat from that too. And by this time the Germans had surrounded the Kensingtons, who had to fight their way out. Enormous bravery was shown, but the day had been lost. The attempt to take Ypres Ridge failed. By nightfall 50 survivors reached Cellar Farm, where they stayed until ordered to return. A roll call found that 13 officers and 423 other ranks were lost. The Kensington battalion was now non-existent, there being no reinforcements. The battalion was taken out of the line and put to lines of communication duties. The bodies of the men killed on the 9th were never recovered. The period of lines of communication lasted till the end of the battle, to the beginning of the November 1916. The Battle of Artois. The next attack on the British front was made by the First Army at Artois. The French generals were very keen on a massive attack by the British at the same time they in the south would attack at Champagne. The French overruled the British generals, and Kitchener declared that the British army should do all that it could to help the French, even though it would result in heavy losses. And this would also help the Russians, who were in need of urgent assistance to draw German reserves away from their front. By September, the British army had fought 4 more important battles: the second Ypres, Ypres Ridge, Neuve, Chapelle, and Loos. They were the prelude to the Somme front. The Battle of Loos, 21st September 1915. On the 21st of September the relative calm was shattered by an artillery bombardment of the German front line. 4 days later the Battle of Loos was launched over flat, dull, open countryside. The village is in a depression with a long gentle slope. To the east there is a low hill which was named Hill 70. Loos lies between La Bassee and the mining areas around Lens. The battle raged as 10 columns in extended line, all in perfect alignment, moved forward. The German machine gunners traversed their guns backwards and forwards, mowing down the lines of men, and each line of 1,000 men moved forward yet again. As the wounded men struggled to rise, the Germans held their fire, allowing the medical teams to take the wounded back, and as soon as they had done that, so they started the machine guns again, and the next advancing line started to fall down again, to pile up, to allow the wounded to be taken back once more. With the end of the battle the front quietened down, As the year drew to a close, many realized that although millions of men had died, the end was still not in sight. The Kensingtons needed new replacements to make up their numbers. After receiving another batch of reinforcements from England, the division was now back up to strength. A training schedule was devised to make the division ready for frontline fighting. The 168th Brigade of the 56th London Division, comprised of the 4th London Fusiliers, the 12th London Rangers, the 13th London Kensingtons, and the 14th London Scottish. The artillery were Londoners, and the Pioneer Battalion the 5th Cheshires. The reformed brigade marched off to Lewes Station, there to entrain for Pont Remy. Arriving in pouring rain, the brigade again marched off to Citerne, and this village is set in undulating countryside with few cottages or hamlets. The weather was squally, with occasional heavy falls of snow. Again the brigade was housed in bell tents in a muddy field, engaged in strenuous training exercises using the latest tactics. The automatic Lewis gun, with its pan of bullets, was going to be an improvement, so too the new grenades. Every day groups were detailed off to become expert in the use of these weapons, including their use wearing a new-style gas mask. Route and forced marches in full fighting kit made at least once a week, and both these distances, over 25 miles, soon led to men dropping out to be picked up by wagon. At last the division set off away from Citerne to Longpre, a large farm complex. By the time the battalion got there, many men were complaining about blisters. They had short shrift from the sergeant, who told them that it was an offence to have blisters, and any more complaints, then the malingerers would receive punishments for not taking due care. This soon settled the people down, and everyone got on with it. Guards were detailed off, and the rest collapsed, utterly exhausted. There were no blankets or food until the following day, and fortunately the roads were congested by marching Frenchmen, blocked with wheeled artillery, all racing to get to Verdun. Their movement delayed us continuing, so we had to have a forced couple of days of rest, interspersed with whatever practices the sergeants could devise to keep us occupied. So went the report made that day. The rolling, low hills and shallow valleys gave Picardy an appearance of a Salisbury plain. It also gave us names to conjure with: Highwood, Chapelle, Throneswood, Martinpiche, Fricourt, Deville Wood, Ginchy and Comblay, to mention just a few. It's compared to Ypres. It had space, unobstructed views, and open countryside, suitable for unrestricted action. This was the scene on top of chalk, lying under much of the region. Ideal stuff to construct deep shelters and communication trenches. The Germans were experts at making the most of their front line, putting all their ingenuity into making substantial living accommodation to back up the forward troops. In fact, both sides dug like mad to make extensive trench systems, and once again the object in battle was to take the strain off the French, who were suffering many casualties at Verdun. When at last the road was clear, the battalion reformed and marched off. The 16 or so miles were completed in the morning. That allowed them to take 2 days' rest, exploring the town, doing some washing and having a canvas bath. And then once again they marched off to Gommecourt, having there an exhibition of a German flamethrower, being told of its uses and problems. The Germans had launched a massive attack on the French line at Verdun on the 21st of February 1916, and although the battle was still raging and the French had lost almost 500,000 men, it was continuing. To alleviate the strain on the French, it was decided that the British should make a strong attack on the Somme. Although the battle had been given the name of the Somme, in fact it was the Battle of Ypres. The battlefield lay between Gommecourt in the north and Maricourt in the south. On the north of Ypres lies the village of Beaumont-Hamel and Sierre. The Somme is the name for a French administrative department, taken from the name of the river which runs through the region. The part protected by the British Army was the north-east corner, overlapping into the next department called the Pas-de-Calais. This region of France formed part of the old province of Picardy. An old Roman road linked its cathedral city, Amiens, and two smaller towns of Albert, north-east of Amiens, and further still, Bapaume. The region was crossed by two rivers, the Somme and the smaller Ypres. The Germans were defending their gains. The Allies intent upon pushing them back. The former constructed deep, secure trenches and dugouts whilst developing small villages into miniature forts. The latter believed such tactics, opposed to aggressive behaviour, laid scant regard on such wasted effort. Their policy was mobility and attack. What was typical, the Germans held the high ground. Not only could they observe what was going on, but they knew that any attack had to be made uphill. The main concern is the north-eastern end of the front line, in a beautiful village called Ypres. There a few village cottages lined the road with tall stately trees, behind which lay orchards and gardens, and as in all villages a fine old church with a tower and several farmhouses. The main employer in the village was the owner of the brick-built mill, now used as the battalion headquarters, with all the usual staff, cooks, runners, signallers, etc. The village lay between the British Third and Fourth Armies, opposite the salient village of Gommecourt, its chateau and park, wood, famous tree, the Kaiser oak, and crossroads. In parts of the front line the German trenches were only 50 feet away. Ypres was now a ghost of its former past. It was in ruins. Even though the church and the village had suffered terribly, the tower of the church still stood proudly silhouetted against the sky. And as with all points of interest, the Germans had the church entrance well within their range, and even though the entrance had been sandbagged, it was a dangerous place to be lingering. The attack on the salient of Gommecourt was to be a diversionary attack made by two encircling flank divisions, both made up of territorials, the 46th North Midlanders to the north and the 56th London Village Territorial Force to the south. The first stage of the encirclement was to seize the German trenches to their front, and the second stage was for each division to make a turn inwards around the back of Gommecourt and cut the resident German garrison off. In itself this is a simple exercise, not complicated by many divergent goals. The 56th London Division was probably the most highly trained territorial division in the British Army. Its four component parts had seen a lot of action already, losing a lot of men, maintaining a high proportion of their original pre-war volunteers. The men were in the main well educated, working as managers and office workers in London's business sector. Each of the battalions prided themselves on their corps construction, representing a particular part of London. Within the London Division were 3 brigades, and each comprising of 4 battalions. Company Sergeant Major Albert Carey was in the 1st 13th London Regiment, the Kensingtons. The other 3 regiments were the 1st of the 4th London Regiment, Royal Fusiliers, the 1st of the 12th London Regiment Rangers, and the 1st of the 14th London Regiment London Scottish. These 4 regiments made up the 168th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Locke, with Sergeant Neame as Brigade Major and Major Wheatley as Staff Captain. They, in turn, were a 4th part of the 56th London Division. The 1st, 5th Cheshires acted as the division's pioneers. In overall command was General Haig. The Third Army was led by General Allenby, and its 7th Corps by Lieutenant General Snow. The 56th London Division, 167th and the 168th Battalions, were led by Major General Hull. In February, March and April 1916, the division was in training. These 3 months allowed the new replacements to become used to their comrades and form a bond with them. In dribs and drabs, each company filled the Hebertin sector on the left of the Somme at Gommecourt. Battle for Gommecourt. This attack was to be a diversionary attack, to take away enemy opposition to the main breakthrough plan, and advance from Ypres towards Bapaume, up the main road to be made by the reserve army of Sir Herbert Gough. From the centre of the main British attack, Gommecourt is some 10 miles north. General Snow stressed that no movement should be made towards Gommecourt until the German defences had been destroyed by the artillery, for there weren't any reserves for this part of the battle. Before the battle, Major General Hull had ordered to construct a completely new trench halfway across no man's land, which was 800 yards wide. At night, 3,000 men were sent over to dig an assault trench only 300 yards away from the German front line. Now the Germans observed all this activity but did nothing about it, keeping well down behind their trench wall, sheltering from the huge barrage that was meant to achieve a distraction from what was going on. This new advanced trench was dug without any loss of life, which was a fine achievement. And the following night the trench was deepened and firing steps put in. This action to prepare no man's land for an attack, to shorten the distance between the start line of the battle and the first enemy trench, saved many lives. And this very simple expediency, as were others like linking shell holes or pushing out a sap, involving the movement of the attacking troops closer to the enemy front line to keep advancing troops below ground level for maximum period, was a practicality that was well worthwhile. That morning the weather was fine. The Battle of Somme commenced, and this was going to be the biggest battle so far, conceived to take the strain off the French, who were beginning to buckle at Verdun. The artillery had exposed the German trenches with continuous fire, and this provoked return fire. It was Saturday the 1st of July, 1960. At 7:30 the attack went in, and at 4 o'clock by the 1st, London Scottish getting into the front line, the Kensingtons followed up, and after being very patient, the British barrage stopped. Whistles blew, and section leaders shouted, as long lines of men set off, making sure they were in line. They walked through the gaps in their own barbed wire made the night before. As the remaining battalions advanced from the newly dug trench, they joined the London Scottish by taking nearly all the German trenches, which was their objective. At Gommecourt, the Kensingtons had achieved success, making use of the new trench dug before the battle. They started a smokescreen to confuse the Germans. The whole front-line system had been taken. On the left, the hard-pressed North Midlanders had not reached the German front line. If they didn't achieve their goal, the Kensingtons would be in trouble. They would be left stranded. 5 hours later, all the German trenches on the right flank of Gommecourt were in British hands. Part of the 169th Brigade, the Queen's Westminster Rifles, also followed up, moving through the London Division to start the linking up movement with the North Midland Division, moving down from the north. As this was happening, some of the Cheshire pioneers were constructing strong points in the German trenches and turning the firing positions to face the German new front line. As the Westminsters moved up between the Kensingtons and the Queens, they were to start a bombing attack on the rear of the Gommecourt garrison. Unfortunately, the Westminsters had received many casualties, and there was no one to direct the attack, leaving the pioneers, Second Lieutenant George Arthur, to lead the attack, though slightly wounded. Forcing their way forwards, the bombers got to within 400 yards of the German trench, almost within reach of where they were to join up with the North Midland Division. The North Midlanders had fared badly, had been forced back towards their own trenches. In the afternoon, General Snow ordered the division to continue with the attack that would link up with the London Division and the Westminsters, who were bombing their way towards them. The order to continue was unrealistic. 6 battalions had started off that morning, and all had been driven back. They were ordered forward again, but there were only 2 companies left by this time, and no officers had survived at all. Then the attack was called off. The Germans, a Saxon regiment, were on the alert. They had been warned by the bombardment, and their lookouts had raised the alarm. The machine guns started to hammer out their awful chorus. The long lines were easy targets. The Germans had seen the gaps in the wire, and had laid down fixed lines of fire to cover them. Men bunched up to get through, but the terrible machine gun fire flattened them. Things on the left were going badly. The night's rain had turned their trenches into a morass. Some of the men were knee-deep in mud all night long. It was difficult to get the men out in time, and as they appeared in dribs and drabs on the top, they were machine-gunned down on top of the others trying to get out. There were long lines of dead and dying men, and in spite of the terrible fire the men still went on trying to get forward, trying to keep in line at a steady pace. The German wire was supposed to be cut by the artillery fire, but was untouched, and trying to get over the wire the strands caught in their equipment or wrapped itself round their legs. At last the facts began to be assembled. It was clear that the British High Command had failed, even though in places it had achieved its objectives. On the first day the British Army suffered the biggest losses for any single day in the whole war. Figures can never tell the whole story, but in this case the casualties were 57,000, of which 20,000 were dead. A whole generation of men were crippled. That kind of slaughter continued until the battle ended in the awful mud of winter. In all, it had cost over 1 million casualties, with 300,000 British, French, and German dead. The next morning the Kensingtons found that they had reached part of their objectives. The night had been spent in the German trenches, taking it in turns to stand guard, which was an eerie sensation, with all the cries for help coming from the wounded, and the stretcher-bearers from both sides collecting up the bodies. It was in the original plan to seize the German trench system on the right-hand side of the salient, and then link up with the North Midlanders, who were coming from the opposite direction. It was hoped to cut off the garrison of German defenders in the village. A company of the Kensington and a machine-gun section of the London Scottish had crossed over No Man's Land and reinforced the previous day's troops. They were the last to do so, and during the rest of the morning the Germans put in 3 attacks to evict the remains of the division, and gradually the Londoners became weaker. The Kensingtons were acknowledged to be part of the London force that was second to none, having the greatest period of training prior to setting off for France, and had been in the fighting force since the war had begun. The London force were mostly well-educated, pre-war volunteers from the commercial heart of London, and many would have been made into officers in any other division. The advance the previous morning got off to a jolly good start, and in the first hour and a half the 168th Brigade, attacking from the newly dug trench in the middle of No Man's Land, had reached every point of the German trenches in their objectives. 1/5 of the attacking Londoners were either dead or wounded, and by reaching the final trench they secured for themselves a safe position. The rolling barrage had moved forward as had been planned, and the Kensingtons and the other 3 battalions had moved up with it. The London Rifle Brigade was on the left of the right-hand division. Gommecourt Park, with its wooded areas before the village, was to their left. The German 2nd Guards Reserve Division pushed back almost out of the salient, but was still holding Fricourt on the front line. What was left of the brigade entered the German trenches, which was the first objective, ready to repel any German foolish enough to try and get it back, including part of the London Scottish machine-gun section. After a period of 4 hours, the London division was still in position, and although the Westminsters had returned to the first objective line, along with the rest of the division, this still held to the original plan. This line was to the rear of the German trench, which was in British hands, and as explained, there were no reserves, so to make a concerted effort to link up with the North Midlanders, more men would have to be found. The worst decision was to do nothing, for the Germans were beginning to take stock and recover. At last information was beginning to get through to headquarters. The corps commanders controlling the diversionary attacks at Gommecourt were determined to carry on with the encircling movement. Lieutenant General Snow ordered the North Midlanders to repeat their attack that afternoon to link up with the London division, which by then was being counter-attacked, gradually being forced back to the captured German trench behind them. Now Snow must have known that the diversionary objective had been achieved. Someone was turning this battle into a separate order of battle, not wanted. Although the London division was being hard-pressed, it retained coherence. Being in the German trench gave the men cover and time to sort themselves out. The Germans, on the other hand, over their initial shock, were getting stronger by the minute. It didn't take them long to understand the significance of the British move. Not that they understood the Battle of Gommecourt was a diversionary one, but that those 2 divisions were trying to encircle them and join up. They intended to prevent that happening. The German guns were ranging in, joining together to bombard the position, and gradually the British troops began to run out of ammunition. Most of the senior officers who had set out in the morning were now either dead or injured, and the afternoon wore on and the fighting continued, and by 4 o'clock there were only 4 officers and 70 men remaining gathered together, holding the German front-line trench. They were now out of touch, and they didn't know whether to go, or whether there was going to be a total rout. and of the 7 battalions to start out, 1,700 men were now dead, 200 were prisoners, and over 2,000 wounded, and most of these were all lying about on the battlefield. And the Germans were systematically raking these with machine-gun fire to kill them, or most annoyed that now and again 1 or 2 of them would pop up and start firing. By evening, when the light was poor, stragglers started to drag themselves in. They were tired, hungry, and distressed, having got so far and not in the end succeeding. The Germans were moving about in no man's land, not only finding their own wounded, but directing all their first aiders and stretcher bearers to find the English wounded too, and this concern for the wounded was reciprocated. There were 4,749 casualties in the London Division alone, out of nearly 60,000. It was a 7-to-1 battle in favour of the Germans. The division remained on the Somme till October.